Hi, and welcome to the School Leadership Show. Unfortunately, Mike can't make it, and he is one of Kim's biggest fans, so he's really sorry to miss it. Today, I am introducing a man who needs no introduction. Kim Marshall is the most recognized name in the field of educational leadership. After being a teacher, a district leader, and a principal, he started a service called the Marshall Memo that he wished he had had when he was a principal. Each week, he reads a ton of journals and other articles online, and he summarizes only the best ones and sends these to leaders all over the world, literally all over the world. However, he's here today to talk about the third edition of his deeply useful book, Rethinking Teacher Supervision and Evaluation: How to Shift the Conversation to Coaching, Continuous Improvement, and Student Learning. Welcome, Kim.
Great to be here.
Glad you're here. So, Kim, for those who know you as the Marshall Memo creator, can you tell us when you first published this book, what was that, like 2008, why you decided to write it at that time? Where did the idea for the book come from?
Well, as a Boston principal, I had, after 6 years of doing traditional teacher evaluations, I was told by a teacher that teachers were actually not reading them. All that work was being wasted. And actually, I could understand that because they were in the classroom. So my brilliant descriptions of what they were doing was not news to them. They just wanted to know how they did. And then someone else said that they didn't feel appreciated. So I shifted gears, really prodded by the teachers I was working with, into short, frequent, unannounced classroom visits with face-to-face feedback, and really sort of putting the whole emphasis on coaching versus on evaluation. And we did that for 9 years. The union people watched me very warily at first, but then gave the green light to it. And then I wrote an article in Kaplan, and I wrote a book, and now we're on the third edition of the book. But the whole stimulus was rethinking a practice that has been demonstrably ineffective over the years.
Sounds a bit like as teachers when teachers give grades to students and narrative feedback, and all they do is look for the grade and then don't even bother to read the narrative feedback. So probably
Right.
similar research going into that, and then ultimately that doesn't end up improving learning. So, what is your feeling about the traditional teacher evaluations as they were originally designed and their impact on teaching and learning?
Well, I was coached by one of the gurus, John Safier, and I sort of worked with him on his early book, The Skillful Teacher, and I thought I was hot stuff. I really was good at capturing all the detail in the classroom and doing a wonderful write-up and page and a half, two-page write-ups and sitting with teachers and going over them. And so it was a bitter pill to swallow when I was told by the teachers I was working with that, in this Boston public school that it just wasn't working. And I actually, of course, am I reading for the memo each week, and I'm reading, 150 articles a week or skimming. And I've been looking like, am I right about this? Am I crazy? And I just keep seeing evidence that of all the things that really change and improve schools, teacher evaluation has never been one. So, it's the dog that hasn't barked, in education. And so, I'm getting constant, affirmation and reassurance that I'm kind of on the right track here. At the same time, the reason for the third edition and the reason for keeping at this and giving, lots of talks every year around the country is not everybody is getting it. Not everybody is having the same moment that I've had. And the old process is remarkably tenacious. People keep doing it, often with cynicism, often with, yeah, well, check the box. But what I see overwhelmingly is evidence that it never is so I should be fair. Some principals are brilliant at this, and some principals have the trust and relationship, one of 1,000, because I ask this poll question all the time, and I led off the new edition of the book with this poll question of, as a teacher, thinking back to your early years as a teacher, what were the four things that were the most helpful in getting you to be a really good teacher and making your kids, do well? And salted into a list of 10 things is the formal evaluation process. And on the very first page of the introduction of the new edition is the graph from anonymous polling of that question. And I think formal evaluations gets no votes whatsoever. And you can guess the things that did make a difference, the things that really do. So the big question I have, the whole thing is, can evaluation ever be a player? Or is it always on the margins, making no difference?
Yeah, I mean, I really, that struck me how few people said teacher evaluation moves the needle at all for teaching and learning. And so, this traditional notion of the teacher evaluation process where you have a pre-observation, one full class that you observe, and then, a debrief. You have a very striking graphic in your book where you show a grid that represents all of the classes that a teacher teaches in a typical year. I think it's about 900 lessons. And then you have, darkened in one or two of those dots. And when you do the traditional evaluation process, that's how much of the teaching you're seeing. That's leaving most of the iceberg under the water.
Mhm.
So I like that you have come up with a different approach to improving teaching and learning through supervising and coaching. And I know that many of the people listening know you as the guru of mini observations. But as you explain in the book, that is only part of it, that to do a really full and complete job of supervising and coaching teachers, you need to supervise and coach teaching, you need
Mhm.
to supervise and coach learning, and you need to supervise and coach planning. And then all of that culminates at the end of the year with a
Right.
more informed teacher evaluation. So I
Right.
thought maybe we could talk about those different parts.
Right. Well, first, I just wanted to say that I'm not the only person who's had this idea. That there are a number of writers. There are actually 7 books out right now, on the basic concept of short, frequent, unannounced visits and an emphasis on coaching. And the original one was the 3-minute classroom walkthrough by Carolyn Downey and colleagues. And
I remember that. Yeah.
I hate the word walkthrough, and I think 3 minutes is not enough. But she had the idea. She and
Yeah.
her colleagues had the idea, and so you're absolutely right. It's not enough to just get into classrooms frequently and authentically. The conversation with the teacher is absolutely essential. And by the way, that's the thing I'm finding it hardest to persuade people of. The default seems to be to send a quick email or to leave a checklist or to send your raw notes to the teacher electronically. And then maybe you'll have a conversation, maybe you won't. And I just feel very strongly, and as a union person, as a teacher union person, I would lay my body on the tracks on that one. If you're in my classroom for a short visit, unannounced, you must talk to me. I
Yeah.
must have an opportunity to give you the bigger picture. So the emphasis on planning, of course, also looking at lesson plans and
Okay,
unit
let's not,
plans.
let's we're jumping. You're jumping. Let's just start with the supervising and coaching teaching. I just want to pause there.
Right.
So you in the book you outline 10 criteria that you need to meet, and one of them is the evaluation. So really 9 aspects of mini observations to make them really work. I'm going to list them really quickly and then we'll go into a few of them.
Ah,
But you say to make them work, they need to be frequent and short, systematic, unannounced. You need to go in with a humble, curious, low tech approach. You need to have one main leverage point, one piece of feedback. You need to be able to see the big picture. You need to have the face to face conversations you were talking about, brief follow up summary emails, and then finally the courage to confront a teacher when you're seeing ineffective practices. So you're saying those are the 9 parts that make a mini observation effective. So
mhm.
you've addressed the face to face, but maybe can you just start with the basics at the beginning, just the frequent and short, systematic, unannounced. What are those, and why are they so important?
Well, the big picture of those is seeing reality. Seeing authentic reality, and that's where a lot of teachers need persuasion on that. I always start out by having people brainstorm all their anxieties about this idea, and they say, caught at a bad moment, or you don't know anything about kindergarten, or you're mean and it's a gotcha, or and so just there are usually 11 objections to it. So by being systematic, you make sure that you don't always come at the same time of the day. That you see a variety, beginning, middle, and end of lessons. By being unannounced, you don't have the dog and pony show, which is very, very important. Frequent is very important, and my sort of default on that one is once a month, which sounds like a lot. People will add up. Well, that's 400 mini observations for me, but actually, if you do the math, it comes out to about a couple a day. And so if you can't get in for, and then the question is short. So how short is short? 3 minutes is too short. 45 minutes is too long. So I've zeroed in, and by the way, there's no good research on this. I've zeroed in about 10 minutes. I think that's usually enough to have plenty to talk about and actually to have to do the job then of narrowing it down to only one leverage point. So the big picture there is see what the kids are really experiencing on a day-to-day basis, which is the crucial thing. And then the second group is how you were a good observer. And you mentioned low tech. So I am really very, very passionate that people should not bring computers or laptops into classrooms or tablets.
That, yeah, tell us about that.
So, well, first of all, it freaks the teacher out, although some people are fine with it. But I think it also distracts you because you think you've got to get everything down, and also you're rooted to a desk, so you're not walking around looking over the kids' shoulders, looking at the rigor of the work, checking in with kids if the teacher's not addressing the class. You're checking in. What are you learning today? Having conversations with kids, and all those things are crucial. The humility part is very important because even if you're really energetic, you're only seeing about 0.1% of a teacher's work. And
Yeah.
so you've got to come in with some humility. And then, and curious, like this is a different way of teaching this. I've never seen that before. So tell me about that. And then to the conversation. Um,
Yeah, and I think, yeah, I don't know if you put it in the book, but I know it's a quote you use all the time, the Yogi Berra quote that,
oh,
you can see a lot just by watching, or you can
right.
observe a lot just by watching. And that sounds so simple, but I
Yeah.
think your point of taking the tech out is very useful.
Mm,
And also taking the checklist out. So this is
mm.
probably controversial too. You don't advocate for leaders coming in with checklists. How do they know what to look for if they're not coming in with a checklist, and why do you say that?
Well, one of the teacher pushbacks on many observations when first presented with the idea is, what are you looking for? Do you have the whole Danielson rubric in your back pocket or on your laptop? And
Yeah,
in fact, in New York City schools, that's what they do. They
yeah.
go in with the Danielson rubric and they're trying to score 4, 3, 2, 1 on all those things. So my big recommendation is look for only three things in a classroom. Have a mental checklist in the back of your head of just three things. Number one, is this the right stuff for this seventh grade math class?
The
Is it
content, yeah.
is it watered down? Is it baby stuff? Is it too hard? Is it the right curriculum? We're teaching South America here. Are you teaching about South America? The second thing is the pedagogy. Like, is this the best way to teach this particular thing? And one classroom I was in yesterday in a school up in Maine, the Spanish teacher, when we walked in for a mini observation, none of the kids were there. And so we said, so where are the kids? She said they're all off around the campus finding specific things in a scavenger hunt and using Spanish numbers to write them down.
Very
So
cool. I love
they're
it.
all off in groups of two, and they actually were asking one specific teacher, how old are you? So it was, 42 in Spanish. And so, and she was thrilled. And so that was great pedagogy for getting hands-on, experiential learning for learning Spanish numbers. And so that's the second thing to look for. And the third thing to look for is actual learning, is evidence of learning. And usually you don't see that during a mini observation. So then that's the conversation. So let's look at your exit tickets, let's look at your poll questions. Let's look at the artwork the kids created. And so it was just those three simple things. Now you have a very general thing about, sort of rigor, pedagogy, and results. And then you're looking, you're opening your eyes, smelling the roses. You're seeing what's working and what isn't working. And then you're thinking, what's my best coaching point? What can I appreciate and what's my best coaching point?
And that must be hard, right? And that's a skill to figure out what is the highest leverage coaching point. When you work with principals, how do you help them distill that from everything they've seen in a class?
Well, what I did in these 8 classroom observations that I just did in the last 2 days in the school up in Maine was to go in with them and watch a couple of classes and then come out to a conference room and brainstorm, first of all, what are all the positives, and then brainstorm what are all the possible leverage points or coaching points, and
Mm.
then begin have that discussion. And this takes practice, and people need help. And my biggest recommendation is do it with somebody else and go through that process. And don't just jump right to the criticism. Start with the appreciation. Start with what's working here, because in most cases there's plenty of stuff that's good. And by the way, the word leverage point I think was coined by Paul Bambrick Santoyo in his
Possibly.
book Leverage Leadership. And I think it's a great term because and so you come out of the observation perhaps with an idea. You're talking to yourself. You're thinking out loud. Okay, I think I'm going to go for the fact that she's only calling on the kids who raise their hands. But then in the conversation, you might change your mind.
Mm.
And in fact, one of the big features of the new book, and this really emerged back in February and March as I was doing the revision, because the book is like, 40, 50% new, was what's the structure of the conversation with the teacher? Like when you're trying to, and the third group in the 10-point list is connecting with the teacher. So you're in frequently, you're seeing authentic stuff. You're honing your skills as an observer. You're being a good, humble, thoughtful observer. A big reason not to have your head down in a laptop or a tablet. But the third thing is how to structure that face-to-face conversation. And so my new thinking on this is an adaptation of the feedback sandwich.
Mhm.
The all feedback sandwich, compliment, criticism, compliment. People roll their eyes. Oh my God, here we go. And so the adaptation is picture a quadrant, okay? A quadrant. The first quadrant is the compliments, specific praise, and authentically, unless it's a total meltdown, there's plenty to praise, but specifics. Then the second quadrant is get the teacher talking. So ask some open-ended questions, not how did you think the lesson went, but tell me something you hoped I would notice. Or tell me what happened right after we left because you were just getting to a good part there. Or tell me about your learning results. Did you get your intended learning results? Going to results. So the teachers usually are eager to talk. Then the third quadrant is your leverage point. And maybe you've changed your mind. Maybe you've made a line of scrimmage decision based on what the teacher said. Now I'm going to go with a different leverage point, a different plan B or C. So you share that. It strikes me that, you're only calling on the kids who raise their hands, and I noticed some other kids who were really quite passive. So what's a way to see the whole class is learning? And so we're going to use, Roku or, some other tech or low tech. And then the fourth quadrant is consolidating that into an actionable next step. And so those are so praise, get the teacher talking, and not just to talk, but to really get insights about the broader picture. Third, leverage point. Fourth, consolidate. And then what I love, the principal called Julia Cox in New York City coined this idea. At the very end, you say, "What's your big takeaway?"
Yeah.
So you
Yeah.
kind of hear back from the teacher then, and it tells you, did you get through, or is this working or not?
I love that. I have a few things to say. Yeah, first of all, I love it. It's a great structure to give principals when they're conducting those conversations, and I really like not just the permission to change your leverage point, but the encouragement to really listen, right? Because you can imagine, right, with a principal who has the leverage point in the back of her head, right? And really all she's doing is waiting to make her point, right? Let's get
Right.
through the niceties. This was all good. The caps were on the markers, praise, praise, right? And they're waiting. But really what you're saying is no, like actually listen and change it if it's not appropriate. And I like that one because it gets the leader to listen, and then two, that it aims for genuine dialogue. And I think that what you're hoping is that this kind of dialogue can be internalized by the teacher. Because even with the Kim Marshall go in once a month, right? Most teaching you're not seeing.
Right.
So you want the teacher to develop the skills of, what did I do well in that class? And what's one thing I could change to make it better? And so by having a dialogue rather than the principal, filling the brain of the teacher with what needs to be done, it's a dialogue. It's
Right.
something you're coming to together.
So I'll definitely put that idea in the fourth edition of the book. Thank you, Jen. But but I mean, it's almost like you're trying to install a chip in their brain. A chip of constant self-reflection.
Of like, what is it that you do after you teach a lesson? Oh, I think about what went well. Be sure to do this next time. And I think about, what could be changed. And I can't change 18 things because I'm human, but I can think of one highest leverage point, right? Imagine having that conversation with Principal Marshall. The other thing I wanted to say before we move on is that idea of the value of going in with another leader or teacher and observing and coming out to norm for those who are overwhelmed with the idea of doing one observation a month. If you're in a large school, it's a great idea, as you point out in the book, to tap some of your assistant principals, and you don't have to do it alone. And in fact, you could, for the first few weeks of school or anytime during the year, go in with your assistant principals, do a few observations, come out, and then see what would be your highest leverage point, what would be mine, and begin to norm and train your leaders and yourself, right? What are we looking for here? So I think there's benefits in spreading the work too.
Although I heard an echo of a very common phrase here of calibration in what you were just saying. And
Yeah.
I worry about calibration because it almost sounds like you're trying to get every principal to have the same observation. And often in a mini observation, people will see different things and each one is okay. And so it is a judgment call. Like, well, where are we going to go with this? So I really, I wouldn't iterate a reliability. That's another term.
Yeah.
But as a superintendent or head of school, I would want to make sure that all my principals and assistant principals were good observers, were
Yes.
thoughtful observers, not necessarily coming to the same conclusion, but and then getting in enough so that they have multiple at bats, and over time, they get to all the important things that this teacher needs to be coached on.
It's a reminder that teaching is an art, it's not a science,
Right.
but there certainly are some leverage points that are of higher value than other ones.
Oh yeah, and sometimes it'll hit you right between the eyes, and
Yeah.
everyone will totally agree. And that's where I think it's important for people to differentiate. This is in the book to differentiate between their pet peeves, the things that just annoy them, but which aren't important, their
Yes.
personal preferences. Like I used to teach it this way when I was a fifth grade teacher, and then
Yes.
the red lines, the things
Yeah.
that we absolutely will not tolerate in the school, and we will immediately all agree that we need to draw the line, and you will never talk that way again to that
Yeah.
child.
Yes, exactly. Well, good. All right. We'll move on for time, but read the book if you want more nuance on the in these 9 areas, or if you want the overview, read my summary. It's coming out this month. So that's about supervising and coaching the teaching that's going on. And then the second part, you talk about supervising and coaching learning. So first of all, what do you mean by supervising and coaching learning? And how do we do that?
Well, so that's the bottom line. I mean, you taught it, but did the kids learn it? And there's a great cartoon which I actually was able to use in the book. A boy is boasting. He taught his dog how to whistle, and the friend leans over and says, "I don't hear him whistling." And the boy says, "I said I taught him. I didn't say he learned it." And that sort of makes the point.
Yeah.
And there is a rather aggressive sentence that some people say, "If they haven't learned it, you haven't taught it." Teachers find that a little bit annoying, but
Yeah.
it does make the point, and some principals say that. So, how do you see learning? And especially, how do you see learning in a mini observation? And so, that's the third part. What to look for is evidence of learning, and that can be part of the conversation. But there's the bigger picture. Okay, so they learned this particular, multiplication table or skill or this grammatical point, but the bigger picture is, do they know how to write? And so there it has to go beyond the mini observations. It has to go to the teacher team, to the PLC, perhaps the professional learning community, as they give a common assessment on quadratic equations, and and they have a discussion. And so part of mini observing is dropping in on teacher teams as well, and listening for that wonderful question that you should hear. Your kids did better at than mine, Jen. What did you do? So a team where not only are you looking at common learning results, either an essay or a quiz or a test or a performance task, but you're really sharing insights about what worked and what didn't work. And so that should be part of the supervision process. So we really went off into a bad blind alley about that one, unfortunately, during the Obama years when they were trying to use students' test scores and value add computations to evaluate teachers based on student learning. And and they it was a disaster. It was a train wreck. All the lawsuits, the teachers won all the lawsuits because it was statistically invalid. But Obama had the right idea. He did have the right idea. It's not
Focus
enough,
on the learning. Yeah.
but you
Yeah.
have to learn it. And
Just
so my whole thing is, okay, as a principal, assistant principal, or instructional leader, you're getting in there, you're seeing the teaching, but
yeah.
you're constantly looking for evidence of learning. And you can do that during the lesson itself. You can do it in the conversation with the teacher. You can do it in the team. You can do it looking at, interim assessment results, always medium stakes.
Yeah.
Never, a major part of teachers' evaluation, but always, having that part be a part of the conversation.
Let me
So,
pause here. Let me ask. So I often see school leaders who are perfectly comfortable doing 10-minute longer observation in a class and giving feedback. But when it comes to teacher teams, I've heard a lot of, oh, I don't want to usurp it. That's their time. Or if you do go, you have to be quiet. And
mm,
I really see the teacher team as an opportunity yes, to observe and give feedback, not come in and take over the agenda. But
exactly.
if you're talking about supervising and coaching learning, then shouldn't you be giving feedback to the team if they are, not focused on student learning? They're planning field trips, or, they never put together a data display. So what's
Right.
your feeling about actually supervising and giving feedback to teams?
Well, I totally agree with you. It is their time, but you need to drop in and you need to look at the, what's actually going on. And you're absolutely right. Implied in what you just said is most PLCs are not going well. PLCs are kind of a disaster around the country. And one workshop that I give, I'm doing it tomorrow, is PLC light, LITE. Like not really getting into the difficult stuff and it requires some steps. You got to be, I mean, when I was a teacher, I was one of 10 sixth grade teachers at the King's School in Boston. And we were all, sort of working away in our classrooms, and we never gave common assessments. If we had done that, if we had given a common math test at the end of October and then sat down as a group, maybe two groups, this 10 is a lot of people, and then actually looked at the results, the data, question by question, and really gotten into what was working and we would have taken off as a school. That simple step. And so setting the table for that and getting that working and getting teachers to the point where they do that is, first of all, an organizational thing, a common planning time, then a cultural thing, and then a supervisory thing, getting in there and seeing it work. So we totally agree, you and I, on that one. That should be a major part of this. And that's where you begin to see, and you forestall the kids failing on the state test at the end of the year, because in October, and in December and March, you've seen check-ins and you've had those good conversations, and teaching and learning are improving in real time.
Yeah, no, I think you put those key foundational elements into place, the time for the common planning, the common assessments, those things, but then you have to supervise that it's working. Just because you put those things in place doesn't mean that that's what's happening in teacher teams, and they may be falling apart for many reasons. Teachers are afraid of data, don't know how to look at it, don't know what to do once they see it. They're not talking about it at all, or maybe they just have interpersonal clashes, and they haven't built up the trust to be able to, as you say all the time, to say to each other, "Oh, look, your students did better than mine on this assessment. Tell us about what you're doing." But
There's also kind of an informal way of doing that. I mean, when you're
yeah,
in a classroom, if the teachers had the kids working in groups or individually, you can go around and to ask a kid, "So what are you learning today?" And if they say, "Well, I'm filling out this worksheet," that's feedback. Or you can say, "I'm really excited, like in the Renaissance, how on earth did these little Italian villages produce this unbelievable art?" And they're full of curiosity and eagerness, and so that's looking at learning. And then just in the corridors or waiting for the buses in the afternoon, sidling up to a kid or in the cafeteria and saying, "So what did you learn today that you didn't know this morning?" I mean, things like that. Just always curious about what's causing learning and how it's going.
yeah, I found sometimes you have to ask student a follow-up question when you go in and you quietly on the side without interrupting the teacher say, "What are you learning?" And they say, "I'm filling out this worksheet." I say, "That's the activity, but what are you learning?" Because kids sometimes misunderstand that, and then they often can't. They're only able to talk
Right.
about the activity, not the learning.
Yeah.
All right, I will move us on for time. So we talked about supervising and coaching teaching with the mini observations, supervising and coaching learning, and then this other part that is so important is supervising and coaching planning. So again, why is planning such an important component for the leader to both supervise and coach?
Well, so, some schools have teachers hand in all their lesson plans on Monday for the week, which is horrible. It happened to my son-in-law at a charter school here in Boston. And that's, because Tuesday's lesson plan should mostly be based on, or partly based on what happened on Monday, the learning results. But lesson planning is only, a very small part of this. And I think rather than collecting them, the principals or, other administrator, when they go in, should check out the lesson plan. In some New York schools, they're in a pocket outside the door, or it's on the teacher's desk, or it's online. So you should have some sense. But I mean, you can get a lot just by watching. But what's the plan here? But much more important is the unit plan. And I'm a big Wiggins and McTighe understanding by design, advocate, and I do training on it. And I think it's really important to know not just the lesson. So the cartoon I got permission from the New Yorker to use at the beginning of this chapter in the book is, a teacher up there doing sums at the board, and this boy asks, "Please, Miss Sweeney, may I ask where you're going with all this?" And that's the bigger question. Okay, here's this lesson, but how does it fit into this 5-week unit on, on the Civil War or on, quadratic equations or on, Spanish verbs or something. And that's where a lot of teachers really, maybe they had the training at some point, but they're not applying it because guess what principals ask for? Lesson plans, not unit.
Day. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So that is, I think, a very important part of supervision, and that's not in in the lesson itself. That's in. So one thing I called out in the book, and I gave his name was Herb Daughtry, who was then, when I was coaching him, a principal in Brooklyn and New York City, and he wanted more insight into the bigger picture. And so he put in an innovation in many observations, which was I go in and I see Jen on Monday, and she thinks, oh, I'm not going to see him again for another month. But then he comes in to watch your seventh grade social studies class, the same one, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. So then he sees the learning and the planning evolving over 5 days with the same group of kids. That's a brilliant idea.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah, and so, just something like that, because you've got to broaden. I mean, you're going in for this mini slice of only 10 minutes. You have to broaden your picture
yeah,
and see, see the larger progression here. And often it's not very encouraging.
yeah,
So that's where
yeah.
the coaching comes in.
Right. So it's not just encouraging or training your teachers to do the units, but then it's also being somewhat familiar with them yourself so that when you go into the class, going back to the mini, one of the things you said is you're looking at content, right? If you're teaching about, what did you say? I don't know, South Africa, whatever, like, that's what they're teaching. So I think having
Oh,
that larger context when you're actually in the classroom.
right. Well, also, if I could time travel back to my years as a principal, I would do UBD training, understanding by design training,
Yeah,
and classrooms, I would look for essential questions on the wall.
yeah.
So here they're doing a unit on Macbeth. I'm looking up, oh, it's actually this high school in New York City, Civic Leadership Academy. Every classroom, when
Mhm.
I was coaching there, had the essential questions on the wall. So really thoughtful, thought-provoking, 3 or 4 questions about Macbeth that would get, and then the teacher returning to those, ladies and gentlemen, look up at that question again. Are we answering that question now? I mean, that's great teaching.
Okay, yeah. And then there's another point that I think it's Paul Bambrick Santoyo makes. When you look at a unit with a teacher, when you look at, let's say, data from an assessment with a teacher, you're actually supervising a lot more than one lesson. So your time is going further, right? So
Right.
if you sit down with a teacher who has a whole unit plan and there is no, the final assessment doesn't match with the teacher, whatever it is, you
Mm.
actually get a bigger bang for your buck for the same amount of time because you're not just going into one lesson. You're seeing the larger picture in the same way if you're looking at data from a student assessment from, let's say, a unit, you're able
Mhm.
to talk about a larger time period. So in some ways, it's a more
Mhm.
efficient way to supervise.
Right, absolutely. Yeah. And this it is sounding, I must say, I'm sure to a lot of your listeners, is sounding like this is really just too hard to do, for ordinary mortals to do. And you can't review every unit plan. You can't, be in every classroom all the time. But I do think, just taking one step at a time, getting in frequently, and then curious about where does this fit in? Okay, now I'm going to look online at the unit plan, which by the way should be done by a teacher team. Ideally, if there's 3 or 4 teachers on a team, they've done it together and they posted it, and maybe probably should run it by you, so you have that bigger picture. But I don't want this to sound like this overwhelmingly difficult task. Although there is a guy, Pete Hall, who in one of his books said and named me, saying this is too hard. Only someone like Kim Marshall can do this. And I think that's nonsense. I really do. I don't think this is rocket science. Most people, once they're liberated from the shackles of this old system, and get in frequently. I think 95% of people can do this, with the proper structure and with some coaching and encouragement from the
You have a
superintendent.
visual in the book of the time it takes to fully do, a complete and thorough one teacher observation, and you spend hours writing it and all
Mhm.
of that. That's about the same amount of time as all these minis put together. And
Right.
hopefully, gathering all this information should make it easier and faster to do the final evaluation if you still need to do that based on
Right.
where you
No,
know.
in fact, the traditional thing takes about 4 hours. The one mini observation cycle, 10 minutes in the classroom, 10-minute conversation, 10-minute brief write-up is half an hour. So in the same 4 hours, you can do 8 mini observation cycles. So it's
Yeah.
just, there's no comparison.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I hope this isn't meant to be overwhelming. You do have a chapter in the book about time management for principals. We won't go into that, but to help with this, you do have a chapter in the book about what superintendents can do to support mini observations. So that should save some time too if you have some support on the district side. And
Right.
the idea, as far as I see it, is to open the lens a little bit more to fully understand what supervising, teaching, learning, and planning can be divided up with different leaders. It just might be having your fingers on the pulse, not having a deep knowledge of every single unit that's taught. But, I really think, thank you. This book really redefines what it means to supervise and coach well. And I think that everybody should be reading it, and I hope they will. Yeah, I think it's fantastic. Any final word? We'll end here.
Well, I think, the reason, why I wrote this new edition 11 years after the second edition was I really, looked, well, first of all, I was encouraged by my wife to think about it. The publisher approached me and said, take a whack at it. And at first I was very skeptical, but then I look back over how my thinking has evolved over the last 11 years, and there's some really new things. One of them is the equity dimension. I really have woken up to the fact that mediocre and poor teaching is a real equity problem,
Yes.
because the kids who suffer the most from that are disproportionately the kids who walk into school with any kind of disadvantage, whether it's, community issues, whether it's poverty, whether it's learning disabilities, whether it's language issues, whether it's trauma of some kind. Those are the kids who especially need good, effective, and highly effective teaching, and who are really harmed by mediocre and ineffective teaching. So that's one of the things that really fires me up every day to do this work is that, really making people, it's not okay to have a bell-shaped curve of teaching competence in a school. Is not okay. You have to bend that curve. And one of the ways you do it is to get in frequently. And the other thing is just how counterintuitive this idea is. I mean, I'm having difficulty persuading people of this, and I'm working hard at it. I give about 100 presentations a year, and I'm writing all the time. And a lot of people are not persuaded. Whether it's the barrier of what can you see in 10 minutes or how can I do this? I really think this is a real matter of huge import to American kids, especially kids who have disadvantages. And I just, that's why this book, that's why, all the work I'm doing is to just really try to get that idea across. And the third thing is not that hard. Once you start doing this, once you get in a rhythm, once you put an out of office message on your email that says, I'm in classrooms. If this is an emergency, call this cell number. But otherwise, I'm out in classrooms. I'm in the cafeteria. I'm in the corridors. I'm just working with kids and teachers. And it really, it's only like a couple a day. And so a principal who can't get into a couple of classrooms a day and have
For
a
10
couple of
minutes.
follow-up conversations with teachers, ideally in their classrooms when the kids aren't there, something is really wrong here. And that's where superintendents and heads of school and school boards really need to begin to think about, what's going on here? Why aren't we doing this?
So let's end with this really compelling purpose to get leaders into classrooms doing some mini observations tomorrow or as soon as possible after letting teachers know you're coming. Thanks again. The book is Rethinking Teacher Supervision and Evaluation, How to Shift the Conversation to Coaching, Continuous Improvement, and Student Learning. Thank you, Kim Marshall. We appreciate you as always, and we'll put your contact info in the show notes.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the School Leadership Show, a podcast for aspiring and practicing school leaders. Send your comments, questions, and show ideas to me, Mike, at schoolleadershipshow.com. And please consider rating the podcast in iTunes and leaving a comment. And definitely pass the show along to your colleagues.